to be launching off into this with our Taking Stock panel, which we do each night. Shane Oliver, AMP Capital Chief Economist, and Angela Vathulka, City of Sydney Councillor and founder of the Small Business Party, join us in the studio. Thanks very much. We've got an insight here into what all Australians want deep down.
And I love this because we're all so worried about the property market, but we dream about our dream home. We still love to dream about the great Australian dream.
And it's not a unit.
Yes,
it's popping up all over the place.
Yeah, exactly.
So they don't
that
quite
extra
meet the dream.
supply.
Apartment living lifestyle choices.
Because generally we want freestanding, we want one story apparently, a couple of bedrooms. Does it fit your dream, Angela?
Not mine. I'm a bit more of, I don't do gardens. Very important.
So you don't want the hills hoist?
No, I don't want the hills hoist. But it's interesting because it's being pitched as the discovery of the Australian dream when that has always been the Australian dream. I think McCrindle, the futurist and social researcher, said also that our abode defines our identity. So it's interesting how our identity keeps shifting a little bit, but nevertheless it is the great Australian dream to have your own home.
Shane, you pointed out before that it doesn't seem to be about apartments. Everybody wants a backyard. It's going to be pretty hard to come by.
Well, it's going to be very hard. And of course there will be a lot of supply of apartments coming in, so people might be forced into something they don't really want, don't regard as their dream. I don't relate to much of this. I have a house which is spread across 3 stories. It's a massively sloping block. It had a very small kitchen when I first got it, but I do relate to the bit about getting a big kitchen, so we did put a big kitchen in. Yep. And I reckon I spent about a couple of months trying to dig out the old Hills hoist, which was stuck in the backyard so firmly with concrete. I was digging it up. Now, this was 20 years
from
ago.
the other generation whose Australian dream was around that.
Yes,
that's right.
With extra concrete.
Correct.
Yes,
I have one of those. It flying off because it does more than just have clothes.
Yeah,
it's a game as well.
That's true. It's a game for the dog if you decide to go pet friendly. I must say, we picked our house because at the time we definitely wanted somewhere with a backyard for our dream dog. And we bought the house and then we did do the dog. So I guess I've ended up in a school catchment for my kids that was determined by my dog. So I fit that one.
So it was dog first.
Yeah, I guess we knew we wanted children, but the house is definitely decided because of the dog.
So you need record this segment, save it for the children on their 21st to show them how important it all was.
The sacrifices you made.
The sacrifices.
One of the most interesting ones and one of the most divisive back in our our newsroom was the view or pool situation. Shane, you said you're on a sloping block. Does that mean you've got nice views?
We do have a view, and there's certainly no room for a pool. And it was chosen because of the view. I mean, that was what it was all about, the view of the water. So to me, that's paramount, having a view. I reckon people have worked out with pools. They're great for a little while, but then you've got to spend forever cleaning them, and they just become a pain.
And now with energy prices, they would become also very expensive to run. And you've always got to have the latest in chemical-free situation, and then you've got to have it heated because if you want to have a pool, you want to swim all year round, and then you might need a roof because if it rains, you can't swim.
We're getting very fussy.
So many problems for the Australian dream.
Too focused on ourselves.
First world problems, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so. I found it interesting because I've always wanted a bush view, and my dream house has a view over the bush. I mean, definitely water, but it's got to have bushland involved. That's my Australian dream.
I'm just saying that there's not a lot in here for us renters, but look, you take your licks, don't you, when you're in the rental market?
That's it. That's it. Okay.
Is your heart breaking just a little bit?
No. Look, it's not. It's renting's fine, and the dream is still there. Okay, that's true. That's true. Right, very good.
It's great to see. I mean, it's great to see that dream is still there, and yet for a lot of people, it's just out of reach. They won't get to it, which probably explains why.
Doesn't that just mean we're really unhappy?
It may be contributing to that people had the expectation of having something like their parents and their grandparents, and then they're not getting that. They're getting the apartment, or they're getting a block which isn't quite the one they want, or the kitchen isn't there, or whatever. And I think that could be weighing on people's feelings of anxiety or lack of happiness.
Well, these are all the realities that people are facing in the property market as well, which brings us quite handily to our next topic, which is, of course, the big headlines around negative gearing today. Labor coming out against a report that was brought out saying that it's going to dramatically lead to a fall in new supply coming on and fewer jobs and all of these sorts of things. Shane, we might start with you. What do you make of the Master Builders report and Labor's response?
Well, I think when you intervene in a market like that if you're changing negative gearing such that you can only negative gear for new property, then that is a massive distortion in the market. It cannot but have an impact. It must have an impact. Whether you grandfather or not, it's going to have an impact. An investor buying in today will still get the benefit of negative gearing, but they would also be aware that at some point down the track, that property they buy, even if it's a new one today, won't be a new one by the time they come to sell. So that means the pool of potential buyers for their property will be lowered. And likewise down the track, investors who currently can go and invest all over the place, do whatever, are now corralled to a very small part of the market and won't have that negative gearing access unless they go into that small part of the market. So when you put that together with the capital gains tax discount being reduced, I think, yes, it will have an impact, and quite a significant one. We've already seen a lot of studies in terms of the negative impact on house prices. I've seen up to 9%. Maybe some of that's already starting to be factored in. It's partly factored into my own forecasts. But I think this is the first one I've seen that actually comes out and says, well, there might be a negative impact on construction work as well. And I think there probably will be.
But as Tiki Fullerton said to us earlier, if you get a panel of 3 people and talk negative gearing, there's probably 7 different ideas that come up. Why is it so confusing? Why is it so debatable?
Well, it's like all sorts of things economic. You know, they're great for dinner party conversations and there's no definitive answer. Yeah. But I think there's a general view amongst a lot of people that the reason we have high property prices is because of negative gearing. I think that this is the bigger picture, that the reason we have high property prices is that we pumped a lot of people into the economy and didn't supply enough homes. So it was a supply-demand story. And also, a lot of people don't understand the experience with negative gearing, which was reduced or eliminated back in the mid-1980s, and that did have a negative impact at the time.
The Keating experience.
Yeah, the Keating experience. Yeah. There's also a generational thing here. If you're younger, you think, oh, well, those investors that I have to compete with, they've got the benefit of negative gearing. I don't when I'm trying to get in there up front, and they feel locked out of the market because of that. But I think the reason they're locked out of the market is because of other things. We just haven't supplied enough property into the market at a time when there's lots of people vying for homes.
And so in summary, you think we could have lower prices and a hit to the construction industry, as was alluded to today?
The short-term impact, I think, will be lower prices. I revised my forecast last week to see a 20% top-to-bottom fall in Sydney and Melbourne.
And that was part of your forecast change?
Yeah, and that was part of the reason I changed it, because of the increasing probability of a change in government. But that would be the immediate impact. Longer term, as time goes by, it will also impact construction activity.
And Angela, as we were saying again with Tiki earlier, this is a very powerful potential scare campaign that the government can use, given house prices are already tracking lower. And you know, Shane's forecasts have gotten quite a lot of coverage as well. It's pretty powerful political tool, and it's something that resonates with people on the ground. And there's, you know, labourers to be targeted quite directly, I guess. And
it's a job loss. Yeah, it's a
diabolical concept that has social justice connotations of the scare campaign here. So negative gearing has always been used as an excuse for why we don't have affordable housing or enough affordable housing, and an easy mark and political target to say, you know, negative gearing is the reason, let's get rid of it, we will have more affordable housing. It's, on the surface, sounds okay, but it is one of those other complicated political scenarios, like messing with self-managed super funds, which will have such massive ripple effects on many things. It will have an effect on small businesses, it will have an effect on employment, it will have an effect on value. If the government or common sense doesn't step in to explain all the connotations, people can be making a decision without full knowledge of the effects of eliminating negative gearing in one circumstance. And Shane and I were discussing this before we came on air. It is diabolical to assume that you would make such a massive economic decision to the economy and it not to have massive implications. It is irresponsible almost to come up with this kind of policy without fully explaining all of it. And no political party is going to do that because it doesn't suit them. So on the one hand, they may think they are going to gain votes, but the economic impact will affect many of us who don't even negative gear, because it will have other ripple effects. So I, for one, would be worried.
Higher rents. I mean, that's a simple outcome that could flow from this.
Well, that's what happened in the 80s,
That's what happened in the 80s.
But why would that happen now?
Because there's just investor interest in the property market becomes less. Because, see, don't forget, the argument is you can still negative gear if you buy a new property, but an investor also has to think about the resale value of that property by the time they come to sell it a few years down the track.
Because Labor's saying we're grandfathering and, you know, not everyone's affected. This is another
but
issue
it will
that's coming
apply
to it.
from the date of introduction of the tax. So if you buy property now, you get the benefit of negative gearing.
Yep.
Fair enough. But there's still an issue what will happen when you come to sell it.
Exactly, that's right.
Because it will then be an old property, not a new property.
So they're
Exactly.
trying to control the market to some degree, but they won't be able to control the market. That's right. There will always be a ramification. Only one person will get that new property and the benefit of the negative gearing. When it comes to selling, that next person, it's an old property, so they can't negative gear. So they may not be able to afford to buy it. And this person who's bought that new property could lose on the property value.
Why are we encouraging people to go and buy properties that, you know, they think they're going to lose money on anyway? This is weird in the system, isn't it? You wouldn't do it for a business. Why do we do it for people with housing?
Well, I think you've got to go back to the overall tax system. A principle of our tax system is that if you undertake investments, you can deduct the cost of that investing, which is the interest cost or whatever, and deduct it against your income. And so what's being proposed here is reducing that ability with respect to one part of the overall negative gearing area. So you can still do commercial property or shares and negatively gear them, so it effectively distorts the tax system. But I think, you know, to their credit, I do think there is a case to look at the capital gains tax discount. I think that's probably a bit too generous, so I would give them a tick on that front. You can debate the amount by which it's reduced, but I think negative gearing is really just introducing distortion in the tax system.
But it's fairer to reduce a rate like capital gains across the board. That's easy to understand and comprehend, and it doesn't distort things. But the negative gearing situation would distort, and it would be almost impossible to gauge where all these impacts would happen exactly.
This is still very much an affordability issue. I mean, Shane, your new forecast talks about a 20% peak to trough fall in Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, young Australians are still looking at this property market and going 20%, there's still no way I can get near that. And I mean, look, we saw in this NAB report that we are going to talk a little bit more about later in the show that Australians don't think that they're that much better off than their parents or that much better off than their grandparents, and surely a lot of that comes down to property and access to the great Australian dream that we were just talking about. So, I mean, is it such a bad thing?
I think I must be way better off than my grandparents. I was surprised.
Look, I think any person who looks at things materially would say they're far better off. You know, when I used to go on a holiday with my parents, this is back in the 1970s, there was always a debate about whether the car would go, would make it there, would go down the hill across the Hawkesbury River in Sydney and probably wouldn't get up the other side, it would overheat. And then it would be going about as far as, a couple of hours north of Sydney. The first overseas trip I did was to Norfolk Island on an old DC-4. Whereas my kids, you get on a jet plane
for $80, head up
for
to
$80 and fly all over the place. So I think any measure of material well-being is much better today. Look at fridges today. People buy a fridge with 2 doors on it. Water that dispenses
so you can see inside.
Yeah, so you can
and it's connected to the internet, so your shopping is easier.
And it makes its own ice. In the old days, you had to pour ice into this little thing and balance it into your fridge.
I still have to do that. Sorry, my fridge still.
So you agree? You think standard of living, you know?
Yeah. I think when we're talking about material possessions, we have more. You know, I grew up with one TV in the house, and we all watched it in the lounge room. You know, now if you don't have a device that displays some kind of Netflix or mainstream TV in every room of the house, there's something wrong. So we seem to be gathering all these things, but along with gathering all that, our overheads have increased exponentially along that same right, because, you know, the reason we have home internet and we've got to have movies and we've got to have 4 devices per person. You know, my parents certainly didn't have that. I'm going to go with my grandparents didn't have that in the Greek village, where they still had to draw water from the well, so their costs were low. So saving was probably technically easier. But things have always been difficult. Everyone always had to save. I mean, I had to work 2 jobs to save for a deposit for my first house, and you know, people thinking a lot these days, you know, young people, that it should be easy to save for a deposit. It wasn't when I was doing it. It wasn't when my parents were doing it. So.
And interest rates were, of course, 18%, you know, when my generation was trying to get into the market.
Well, business rates for me were 18% too, and yet my business was doing better.
Life was really tough stuff. When I was a kid, if it got hot in the car, you had to wind the window down with this thing called a winder, and sometimes it would break. These days you just push a button and down it goes.
Oh, I know my now husband had an old Volvo with no air conditioning and winding the windows, and the 40-degree days.
Did you stick to the seat?
Oh, absolutely. The car got sold for $1, you know, when we got rid of it. But
memories, right?
Great memories. You kind of didn't want for much, actually, in some ways, when you got a car like that.
You know, the pension age is 65.
Yeah.
When that was set, back in 1900, I think the average life expectancy was something like 55. So 65 was a logical number because most people didn't make it there.
It's the equivalent of being like 150 now, right?
Yeah, something like that today. Now you get to 65 and you could, touch wood, you can look forward to maybe another 15 years, at least another 15 years.
Well, you have to work another 15 years now.
Well, yeah.
Because 65 is too young to retire and get the pension.
It's too young to retire, but look at the number of Australians who go overseas on holiday, and mostly that age group, or buy giant Winnebagos and travel around the country. That wasn't something that my parents or my grandparents' generation did.
It's really interesting you bring that up, because we looked into this a little while ago and we saw that a return trip ticket to London back in the 70s was, you had 5 of those and you had your deposit for your house. Now it's 140 of those and you get your kind of deposit for the house. So it's really no wonder that Australians are doing more travel, because it's relatively speaking becomes so much cheaper. Well, a house has definitely not done that.
I think the housing issue is the one thing where baby boomers have let down subsequent generations, and I'm a baby boomer. I've got the benefit of it, but I am really annoyed at the way it's gone on housing. The house I am in at the moment, if my wife and I had come along today, being 30-year-olds, what we were back then, we would not be able to afford it, and I think that's really sad. And I think we've let down a generation. Poor planning. I like the fact that Gough Whitlam and whoever it was back in 1973 were trying to relocate people to Albury, Wodonga and do what you've got in America. We've got lots of cities across the country with 800,000, 1 million people. Whereas we in Australia, we all concentrate in these handful of cities on the coast. We then put fences around it, development restrictions, you can't do anything in there. And little wonder, what have we got? We've got expensive housing. I think that's a major...
And density and not a lot of amenity.
Density and all the debt that goes with that. So I think we've really let down younger generations here, and this is something that we really need to look at. But I don't think negative gearing is... Fiddling with negative gearing is the solution to it.
Angela Vathoukas and Shane Oliver, thank you so much. We had the Learning Planet top 10 list for travel, because we just talked a little bit about travel. We didn't quite get there.
We can't afford it, and there's no time.
No, Aussies are spending up more on holidays next year, this survey reckoned today. Thanks, guys.